The ranch hands stopped mid-stride, their rough hands frozen on Magnolia Whitmore's arms as her father's voice cut through the Montana dawn like a blade. Judge Ezekiel Whitmore stood on his mansion's porch, his weathered face carved from stone, watching his only daughter being dragged from her bedroom in nothing but her nightgown. This wasn't a kidnapping, it was an order. The hired men exchanged glances, their calloused fingers tightening on the 19-year-old girl's flesh as she thrashed against them. The sound of her bare feet scraping against the wooden porch echoed across the valley like a prayer being torn apart. Maggie's green eyes, wide with disbelief, locked onto her father's face, searching for any trace of the man who had once read her bedtime stories. He had kissed her forehead just last night, whispering, "Sleep well, my darling girl." "Papa, please!" The words ripped from her throat as the wagon wheels began to turn. What kind of father destroys the thing he loves most? And why did Judge Whitmore's hands shake as he watched his daughter disappear into the wilderness? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, the Whitmore Ranch had been a different world entirely. Magnolia Maggie Whitmore had spent her 19th birthday alone in the rose garden behind the sprawling Montana mansion, her easel positioned to catch the morning light as it spilled across the valley. At 280 pounds, she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to apologize for taking up space. But when she painted, something magical happened. Her brush strokes were confident, bold, capturing the wild beauty of the frontier with an artist's eye that saw beyond the surface. Her father, Judge Ezekiel Whitmore, watched from his study window as he did every morning. At 55, he commanded respect in every courtroom from Helena to Billings, his decisions shaping the future of the Montana Territory. Wealthy beyond measure from cattle ranching and land speculation, he owned 50,000 acres of prime grazing land and employed over 100 men. Yet this morning, like every morning for the past 7 years since his wife Eleanor's death, his weathered hands trembled as he gripped his coffee cup. The family doctor's words echoed in his mind. 6 months, Judge. Your heart is giving out. Make peace with your affairs. But how could a man make peace when his only child, his brilliant, beautiful daughter, would be left defenseless in a world that devoured the vulnerable? Maggie's artistic talent rivaled any painter he'd seen in San Francisco or Denver. Her memory for poetry was extraordinary, and her kindness drew every stray animal and lonely ranch hand to their door. But society saw only her size, and Judge Whitmore knew with crushing certainty that the wolves would circle the moment he was gone. Eleanor had been the same size when she died. The official cause was complications from her weight, but lately strange memories had been surfacing. The family doctor's nervous behavior, Eleanor's sudden illness after months of perfect health, the way she'd whispered, "Protect Maggie from them, Ezekiel," with her dying breath. Down at the bunkhouse, a new ranch hand named Jeremiah "Jerry" Blackwater saddled his horse with practiced efficiency. 26 years old, with the lean build of a man who'd spent years in the saddle, Jerry possessed an education that seemed at odds with his rough clothes and calloused hands. When he quoted Shakespeare to the other cowboys or discussed current events with unexpected sophistication, they assumed he'd picked up learning somewhere along the trail. None suspected that beneath his worn hat lay a Harvard degree, or that his real name was Jeremiah Blackwater III, son of the physician who had attended Eleanor Whitmore's deathbed. Jerry had come to Montana with revenge burning in his heart. His father had died in disgrace, branded a quack after Eleanor's death ruined his reputation. For 2 years, Jerry had planned his approach, learning ranching skills and crafting the perfect identity. He would destroy Judge Whitmore's life piece by piece, starting with the thing the judge loved most, his daughter. But as Jerry watched Maggie paint in the garden, something unexpected stirred in his chest. something that felt dangerously like admiration. The wagon wheels carved deep ruts in the dusty Montana soil as they carried Maggie away from everything she had ever known. Her wrists bore rope burns from struggling against her bonds, and her nightgown provided little protection against the August morning chill. The two ranch hands, Jake Morrison and Pete Sullivan, avoided her eyes as they drove deeper into the wilderness, their faces grim beneath their weathered hats. "Where are you taking me?" Maggie's voice cracked like dry timber, but neither man answered. The only sounds were the creaking of leather harnesses and the rhythmic clop of hooves against packed earth. After 3 hours of bone-jarring travel, they reached a remote cabin nestled in a grove of towering pines 50 miles from the main ranch. A painted sign by the door read, "Hartwell Wellness Facility, Restoration Through Discipline." Dr. Cornelius Hartwell emerged from the cabin like a specter from a nightmare. Tall and gaunt, with steel-gray hair slicked back and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog every flaw, he carried himself with the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. His black coat was immaculate despite the frontier setting, and when he smiled, Maggie felt ice water flood her veins. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his cultured Boston accent cutting through the mountain air. "Your father has entrusted me with your rehabilitation. I assure you, by the time we're finished, you'll thank us both." Inside the cabin, the facade of medical respectability crumbled. What had appeared to be a peaceful retreat from the outside revealed itself as a prison designed to break spirits. The main room contained medical equipment that looked more suited to torture than healing, restraint tables, metal devices whose purposes Maggie couldn't fathom, and cabinets filled with bottles bearing ominous labels. The air reeked of carbolic acid and something else, something that reminded her of the slaughterhouse back on the ranch. Dr. Hartwell led her to a small, windowless room containing nothing but a straw mattress and a chamber pot. "You'll find the accommodation Spartan, but comfort breeds weakness. Your father has paid handsomely for results, and results require sacrifice." He gestured to a rough-hewn table where a thin soup and crust of bread waited. "This represents your daily sustenance. No more, no less. Your body has been your enemy. We shall teach it to be your servant." As the doctor locked the door behind him, Maggie heard voices from other rooms, soft crying, desperate whispers, and occasionally the sound of someone pleading for mercy. She wasn't alone in this hell. Through a crack in the wall, she glimpsed another young woman, perhaps 20 years old, huddled in a corner. The girl was painfully thin, her ribs visible through her tattered dress, her eyes hollow with despair. "How long have you been here?" Maggie whispered through the gap. "8 months," came the barely audible reply. "I was like you once. My father said it was for my own good." The girl's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "2 others have been here longer. We don't speak of the ones who didn't make it through the treatment." That first night, Maggie discovered the true nature of Dr. Hartwell's wellness facility. The man who entered her room at midnight wore the clothes of a ranch hand, but moved with military precision. This was Jeremiah Blackwater, though she didn't know his name yet. His face was masked by shadow, his voice deliberately gruff as he barked orders. "On your feet! Exercise time!" He forced her to perform calisthenics until her legs gave out, then dragged her to her feet to continue. When she collapsed from exhaustion, he stood over her like a predator. "Weakness is a choice. Tomorrow, you'll choose differently." But in the darkness, something strange happened. As Maggie lay gasping on the straw mattress, she felt something slide under her door. A small piece of bread wrapped in cloth, and a note written in educated script. "Strength comes from within. Don't let them break what makes you beautiful. A friend in shadows." The contradiction confused her. The same hands that had forced her to exercise until she vomited had also left her food and words of encouragement. Was her tormentor also her secret protector? In her exhausted state, she couldn't make sense of it. Over the following days, the pattern continued. During Dr. Hartwell's examinations, humiliating procedures that served no medical purpose, Jerry would appear as the enforcer, cold and demanding. But in the quiet hours before dawn, the mysterious notes appeared with increasing frequency, sometimes accompanied by wildflowers or small sketches that showed an artist's sensibility. By the end of her first week at the facility, Maggie had lost 15 pounds and most of her illusions about her father's love. But she had also discovered something unexpected, a growing fascination with the man who seemed to be both her destroyer and her salvation. Who was he really, and why did his eyes, when she caught glimpses of them in the lamplight, hold such profound sadness? 3 weeks into September, the morning mist clung to the pines like ghostly fingers as Maggie sat on the rough-hewn bench outside the facility, sketching wildflowers with a charcoal stub Jerry had secretly provided. Her body had already changed dramatically, 28 pounds lighter, her face gaunt, but somehow more defined, revealing the delicate bone structure that had always been hidden beneath layers of flesh. Dr. Hartwell called it progress. Maggie called it slow starvation. The sound of boots on gravel made her quickly hide the sketch beneath her threadbare shawl. Jerry approached with his usual stern expression, but something was different today. Instead of barking orders, he sat beside her on the bench, maintaining his cover but positioning himself so Dr. Hartwell couldn't see them from the cabin windows. "You're holding up better than most," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual harsh edge. For the first time, Maggie heard the cultured accent beneath his rough frontier drawl, the unmistakable polish of an Eastern education. "Most people don't have practice being treated like they're worthless," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. "I've had 19 years of training." Jerry's jaw tightened. "Your father." "My father had me dragged from my bed like a criminal." The words came out sharper than broken glass. Whatever his reasons, he chose Dr. Hartwell's methods over his daughter's trust. For a long moment they sat in silence as morning birds called from the forest. Then Jerry pulled something from his jacket, a small, leather-bound book of poetry. "Can you read?" he asked, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, that was—" "I'm nobody. Who are you?" "Are you nobody too?" Maggie quoted softly. "Emily Dickinson." "Yes, I can read. I can also paint, play piano, speak French, and recite the entire Constitution from memory." Shocking as it may be, fat girls can be educated too. Jerry stared at her with undisguised amazement. "You know Dickinson?" "I know all the great poets. Literature was my escape when the world became too cruel." She gestured to the hidden sketch. "Art, too. My tutors said I had real talent. But what's the point? Society doesn't want beautiful things from ugly people." "You're not ugly." The words tumbled out before Jerry could stop them, raw and honest. You have the most expressive eyes I've ever seen. When you draw, your whole face lights up. It's like watching someone discover fire." Maggie felt heat rise in her cheeks. No man had ever spoken to her that way, not as an object of pity or a burden to be managed, but as a woman worthy of admiration. "You're kind to say so, but I'm not kind." Jerry's voice turned bitter. "If you knew why I'm really here, you'd never speak to me again." Before Maggie could respond, Jerry stood abruptly and resumed his harsh demeanor as Dr. Hartwell emerged from the cabin. "Exercise time," he barked loudly. "Dr. Hartwell wants to see improved endurance today." That evening, as Maggie lay on her straw mattress, she found not just the usual piece of bread under her door, but a full letter written in Jerry's careful script. Miss Whitmore, I cannot explain the circumstances that brought me here, but I need you to know that every cruel word I've spoken in front of the doctor has been an act. You are not the person they say you are. You're brilliant, talented, and stronger than you know. Hold on to that truth, no matter what happens next. J.B. The next morning brought a new horror. Dr. Hartwell introduced his latest therapeutic innovation, isolation therapy. Maggie was locked in a root cellar beneath the cabin, a space so small she couldn't fully stand upright, with no light save for what filtered through the wooden slats above. The darkness was absolute, the silence deafening except for the sound of her own breathing and the scurrying of rodents in the walls. Sensory deprivation allows the mind to reset itself, Dr. Hartwell explained to Jerry as they stood above the cellar door. 3 days should be sufficient to break her remaining resistance. Jerry's hands clenched into fists at his sides. And if she doesn't survive it, then she was too weak to deserve salvation. The doctor's cold smile made Jerry's blood run cold. Your job is to monitor her condition every 6 hours. Report any signs of mental breakdown immediately. For the first day, Maggie fought the panic that clawed at her chest like a living thing. She recited poetry, sang hymns her mother had taught her, and tried to sketch imaginary pictures in the darkness. But by the second day, hallucinations began. She saw her mother's face swimming in the blackness, heard her father's voice calling her name from very far away. It was during one of these episodes that Jerry made his choice. When he opened the cellar door for his evening check, he found Maggie curled in a corner, talking to empty air about tea parties and her mother's rose garden. Without hesitation, he climbed down into the cramped space. "Maggie," he whispered urgently, "look at me. You're not alone." Her eyes, when they focused on his face, were wild with fever and fear. "Jerry, are you real, or are you another ghost?" Instead of answering, he pulled her into his arms, feeling how thin she'd become, how her whole body trembled with exhaustion and terror. "I'm real, and I'm going to get you out of here." "You can't," she whispered against his chest. "Dr. Hartwell will punish you. He'll send you away." "Let him try." Jerry's voice was fierce with protective rage. "I won't let them destroy you. Not you." In that moment, pressed together in the darkness beneath the earth, something shifted between them. Maggie felt it first. The way Jerry's breathing changed, the tenderness in his touch as he smoothed her tangled hair. When she lifted her face to his, their lips met in a kiss that tasted of desperation and hope, and the kind of love that blooms in the darkest places. "I don't even know your real name," she breathed against his mouth. "Jeremiah Blackwater," he confessed, "and I have so much to tell you." October arrived like a harbinger of doom, painting the Montana mountains in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Maggie of the blood she'd seen on Dr. Hartwell's surgical instruments. The isolation treatment had left her weak but not broken, and Jerry's nightly visits had become the lifeline that kept her sanity intact. In the darkness of her cell, he'd revealed fragments of his past, his Harvard education, his father's disgrace, and the burning need for revenge that had brought him to the Whitmore Ranch. "My father was Dr. Benjamin Blackwater," Jerry whispered during one of their secret meetings. "He attended your mother's deathbed. After she died, he was blamed for her death, run out of practice, died broken and penniless. I came here to destroy your father, the way he destroyed mine." Maggie's heart clenched, but not with the betrayal she expected to feel. Instead, she saw the pain in Jerry's eyes, the weight of grief that had driven him to this remote corner of hell. "And now," she asked softly, "now I know my father was innocent." Jerry's voice cracked with emotion. "The more I learn about Dr. Hartwell's methods, the more I realize there was something else going on when your mother died, something my father tried to stop. Their investigation began in earnest when Jerry discovered Dr. Hartwell's correspondence hidden in the cabin's floorboards. Late at night, while the doctor slept, Jerry would sneak into the main room and photograph documents with a small camera he'd concealed in his belongings. The letters revealed a network of wellness facilities spanning from California to New York, all funded by wealthy families seeking to correct their imperfect children. But the most chilling discovery came in a letter dated just 6 months earlier. Project Purity proceeds as planned. Federal backing secured. Recommend expanding to include genetic defectives, mental deficients, and other undesirable elements. The American bloodline must be preserved at all costs. Senator Augustus Cromwell, Committee for National Improvement. Dear God, Maggie breathed when Jerry showed her the document. They're not trying to cure us. They're trying to eliminate us. The scope of the conspiracy became clearer with each stolen document. Hundreds of young people from prominent families had been sent to these facilities, supposedly for their own good. The mortality rate was staggering. Nearly 40% never returned home. Those who did survive were often so traumatized they never spoke of their experiences. Meanwhile, Judge Whitmore's health deteriorated rapidly at the main ranch. The foreman, Tom Bradley, had begun sending worried telegrams to business associates, though he didn't dare contact Dr. Hartwell directly. The judge spent his days in his study, staring at a portrait of his late wife, Eleanor, sometimes talking to her as if she were still alive. "I tried to protect her, Eleanor," he would whisper to the painting, "but I may have sent her to the same fate that took you. How can I live with myself if I've killed our daughter to save her?" One night in mid-October, Tom Bradley discovered the judge collapsed on his study floor, blood streaming from his mouth, clutching a letter in his trembling hand. The letter was from Dr. Hartwell, describing Maggie's remarkable progress and requesting additional funding for advanced procedures. Between the lines, any father could read the truth. His daughter was dying by inches. Back at the facility, Jerry had recruited the other surviving girls into their growing resistance. Sarah Mitchell, the thin girl Maggie had first glimpsed through the wall crack, revealed that 2 other patients had died in the past month, their deaths recorded as complications from pre-existing conditions. The remaining girls, Elizabeth Hartwell, no relation to the doctor, and Mary Catherine O'Brien, were in various stages of physical and mental breakdown. "We have to get out of here," Sarah whispered during one of their clandestine meetings in the supply closet. "But how? The nearest town is 50 miles away, and Dr. Hartwell has men watching the roads." Jerry had been thinking the same thing. His original plan for revenge had evolved into something far more urgent, exposing the entire network before more innocent people died. "There's a telegraph office in Helena," he said. "If we can get word to the right people, newspaper editors, federal marshals, reform politicians, we might be able to bring down the whole operation." The plan they hatched was desperate but achievable. Halloween night would provide the perfect cover, as the entire territory would be celebrating with festivals and parties. Dr. Hartwell had already announced his intention to attend a medical conference in Billings, leaving only 2 guards to watch the facility. But their scheme required a terrible sacrifice. One of them would have to stay behind to create a distraction, almost certainly facing death or worse punishment. Without hesitation, Jerry volunteered. "No," Maggie said firmly. "You're the only one who understands the documents, who can explain the conspiracy to the authorities. It has to be me." "I won't leave you." Jerry's voice was fierce with desperation. "I've already lost everything that mattered to me once. I won't do it again." It was Elizabeth who provided the solution, though her suggestion chilled them all to the bone. "There's another way," she said quietly. "Dr. Hartwell keeps morphine in his surgical cabinet, enough to make someone appear dead for several hours. If we time it right, the risks were enormous. Too little morphine and the deception would fail, too much and death would be real. But it was their only chance to fool Dr. Hartwell completely, while giving Jerry and the others time to reach Helena. As they refined their plan, Jerry made another discovery that changed everything. Hidden in Dr. Hartwell's personal journal was a detailed account of Eleanor Whitmore's death. Patient exhibited unusual resistance to treatment. Standard procedures ineffective. Applied mercury poisoning protocol as approved by Senator Cromwell. Death occurred within 72 hours. Family physician Dr. B. Blackwater suspected foul play but lacked evidence. Discredited him through usual channels. "He murdered your mother," Jerry said, his voice hollow with shock. "And my father died trying to prove it." The revelation recontextualized everything. Judge Whitmore's harsh treatment of Maggie wasn't cruelty. It was a desperate father's attempt to make his daughter strong enough to survive the same forces that had killed his wife. Jerry's father hadn't been a failure. He'd been a hero who paid the ultimate price for standing up to a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. "We're not just escaping," Maggie said with newfound determination. "We're finishing what your father started. We're going to expose them all." The night before Halloween, as they made their final preparations, Jerry pulled Maggie aside. "I need you to know something," he said. "When I first came here, I planned to seduce you as part of my revenge against your father. I wanted to ruin you the way I thought he'd ruin my family." Maggie felt as if she'd been struck. "And now? Now I know that you're the best person I've ever met. You're brave and kind and beautiful, and I love you more than my own life. If we don't survive this, I need you to know that meeting you changed everything for me." The kiss they shared tasted of sorrow and hope intermingled, two souls finding each other in the darkest possible circumstances. Tomorrow would bring either freedom or death, but tonight they had this moment of perfect understanding. As October 31st dawned gray and cold, Dr. Hartwell made an unexpected announcement that shattered all their carefully laid plans. "I've decided to remain at the facility tonight," he said with his cold smile. "Recent security concerns require my personal attention. Besides, I have a special procedure planned for Miss Whitmore. Something that will complete her transformation once and for all." The surgical instruments gleaming on his table suggested that this procedure would be Maggie's last. Their time had run out, and escape was no longer an option. Now they faced a choice between fighting and dying, with no guarantee that anyone would survive to tell their story. But as Jerry looked into Maggie's eyes, he saw not fear, but fierce determination. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Halloween night descended on the facility like a funeral shroud, the autumn wind howling through the pines with an otherworldly fury that seemed to herald approaching doom. Dr. Hartwell had dismissed his usual guards, claiming he preferred to handle the evening's special procedures personally. His surgical instruments lay arranged on a metal tray with military precision. Scalpels, bone saws, and devices whose purposes Maggie preferred not to contemplate. "Tonight, Miss Whitmore, we complete your rehabilitation," Dr. Hartwell announced with the satisfaction of a man about to conclude a masterpiece. "Your father has authorized me to use any methods necessary to ensure your transformation is permanent." Jerry stood frozen in the doorway, his hands clenched into fists as he watched the doctor prepare his hellish toolkit. Every instinct screamed at him to attack, to tear the man's throat out with his bare hands, but he knew that rash action would doom them all. The other girls huddled in their cells, understanding without words that tonight would determine whether any of them saw another sunrise. The procedure Dr. Hartwell had planned was medieval in its cruelty. Using techniques borrowed from battlefield surgery and asylum practice, he intended to remove portions of Maggie's stomach, permanently altering her ability to process food. The body must be taught that excess is impossible, he explained to Jerry with clinical detachment. Physical limitation where mental discipline has failed. As midnight approached, the facility became a theater of horrors. Dr. Hartwell strapped Maggie to the surgical table despite her desperate struggles, her screams echoing off the cabin walls like the cries of the damned. Jerry was forced to assist, holding her down while the doctor prepared his instruments, every touch a betrayal that burned his soul. "Please," Maggie gasped, her green eyes wide with terror as she stared up at Jerry. "Don't let him do this, please." The words shattered something fundamental inside Jerry's chest. He'd endured weeks of watching her suffer, telling himself it was necessary for the greater good, but this was beyond endurance. As Dr. Hartwell raised the first scalpel, Jerry made his choice. "No," Jerry said quietly, stepping back from the table. Dr. Hartwell looked up in surprise. "Excuse me?" "I said no." Jerry's voice grew stronger, more certain. "I won't help you butcher her." The doctor's pale eyes narrowed dangerously. "You forget yourself, Mr. Blackwater. Your employment here depends on absolute obedience." "My employment here is finished." Jerry reached for the pistol he'd concealed beneath his shirt, but Dr. Hartwell was faster than his gaunt frame suggested. The older man lunged across the table, scalpel flashing in the lamplight, catching Jerry across the ribs before he could draw his weapon. The two men crashed into the cabin wall, medical instruments scattering as they grappled for control. Jerry's youth and strength should have given him the advantage, but Dr. Hartwell fought with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. The scalpel found flesh again and again, painting the wooden walls with crimson as they struggled. Meanwhile, Maggie had managed to work one hand free from her restraints. Ignoring the agony in her wrists, she reached for the leather straps holding her other arm, her fingers slick with sweat as she fought to escape the surgical table. The sounds of combat filled the cabin, grunts of effort, the crash of overturned furniture, and the sickening thud of fists against flesh. Sarah Mitchell appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel, having picked the lock on her cell with a hairpin Jerry had provided. Behind her came Elizabeth and Mary Catherine, all three girls armed with makeshift weapons, broken chair legs, kitchen knives, anything they could find. The sight of their torturer locked in mortal combat with their secret protector galvanized them into action. "Kill him!" Sarah screamed, raising a heavy iron poker above her head. "Kill the bastard!" But even as the girls converged on Dr. Hartwell, the sound of approaching hoofbeats thundered across the clearing. Through the shattered cabin windows, they could see torches bobbing in the darkness, riders approaching fast. Jerry's heart sank as he recognized the lead horseman's profile against the flames. Judge Ezekiel Whitmore had come for his daughter. The judge burst through the cabin door like an Old Testament prophet, his weathered face a mask of righteous fury as he took in the scene before him. His daughter strapped to a surgical table, blood on the walls, his trusted physician locked in combat with a man he'd hired to protect her. "What in God's name is happening here?" Judge Whitmore roared, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench. Dr. Hartwell managed to break free from Jerry's grip, his surgical coat torn and bloody, but his composure rapidly returning. "Judge Whitmore, thank heavens you've arrived. This man has gone insane, attacked me while I was conducting the procedure you authorized." "I authorized corrective treatment," the judge said slowly, his eyes taking in the surgical instruments, the restraints, the terror in his daughter's eyes. "Not this." "Sometimes the cure is harsh," Dr. Hartwell replied smoothly, straightening his coat. "Your daughter's condition required extreme measures." "Surely you understand the necessity." "The only thing I understand," Judge Whitmore interrupted, pulling a cavalry pistol from his coat, "is that I've been a goddamn fool." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. For the first time since her ordeal began, Maggie saw something she'd thought lost forever. love and regret warring in her father's eyes. "Papa?" she whispered from the surgical table. "I'm here, sweetheart," Judge Whitmore said, his voice breaking as he moved to her side. "I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting you." Dr. Hartwell backed toward the rear door, his pale eyes darting between the armed judge and Jerry, who was slowly rising to his feet despite his wounds. "You're making a mistake, Ezekiel. Without proper intervention, she'll never survive in civilized society. Look at her. She's weak, dependent, useless as a woman." The gunshot silenced him mid-sentence. Judge Whitmore stood with his smoking pistol extended, his face carved from granite as Dr. Hartwell crumpled to the floor. "My daughter," he said quietly, "is the strongest person I know, and I nearly killed her trying to make her strong." As Jerry freed Maggie from the remaining restraints, she fell into her father's arms for the first time in months. But their reunion was interrupted by a new horror, the sound of more horses approaching and voices shouting orders in the darkness. "Federal marshals," someone called from outside. "This facility is under investigation." The conspiracy Dr. Hartwell had served was unraveling, but its tentacles reached far beyond one remote cabin in Montana. The real battle was just beginning, and Maggie realized with growing dread that her ordeal might have been only the opening chapter in a much larger and more dangerous story. But for this moment, held between her father's protective arms and Jerry's loving gaze, she allowed herself to believe that the worst might finally be over. She was wrong. The federal marshals who stormed the facility that Halloween night were not the saviors Maggie had hoped for. Led by a cold-eyed man named Marshal Vincent Crawford, they moved through the cabin with military precision, their badges gleaming in the lamplight as they surveyed the carnage. But something felt wrong from the moment they entered. Their eyes held no shock at the surgical equipment, no outrage at the obvious signs of torture. "Dr. Hartwell," Marshal Crawford said, kneeling beside the physician's body with professional detachment. "Unfortunate. He was a valuable asset to our operation." Judge Whitmore's blood ran cold. "Your operation?" Crawford stood slowly, brushing dust from his uniform as his men surrounded the small group of survivors. "The Federal Committee for National Improvement, Judge. Surely you didn't think a facility of this sophistication could operate without government oversight?" The truth hit like a physical blow. Dr. Hartwell hadn't been running a rogue operation. He'd been working for the United States government. The wellness facilities were part of a coordinated program to eliminate what the federal authorities deemed undesirable elements from American society. "You're all under arrest," Crawford announced with bureaucratic efficiency. "The judge for destruction of federal property, the ranch hand for assault on a federal agent, and the girls as material witnesses who require protective custody." Jerry stepped protectively in front of Maggie, despite his wounds. Protective custody in another facility like this one? Crawford's smile was winter cold. "Mr. Blackwater, yes, we know who you are. Your father caused us considerable trouble with his meddling. We won't make the same mistake twice." The nightmare was beginning anew, but this time with the full weight of federal authority behind it. As the marshals began applying shackles, Maggie felt the last vestiges of hope drain from her heart. Her father's desperate attempt at rescue had only delivered them all into the hands of an even more powerful enemy. Judge Whitmore was separated from the others immediately, loaded into a prison wagon bound for the federal detention facility in Helena. As they dragged him away, he called out to his daughter with the desperation of a man facing eternity. "Maggie, remember what your mother told you, the rose garden, the 13th bush." His words seemed like the ravings of a dying man, but Maggie's artist's memory catalogued every detail. Her mother had spent countless hours in that garden, tending roses that seemed to thrive under her care. The 13th bush was different from the others, smaller, planted in a location that seemed almost random. Jerry was thrown into a separate wagon, bleeding heavily from his wounds but still fighting against his restraints. "This isn't over," he shouted as they hauled him away. "People know about this place. Word will get out." But Marshall Crawford only laughed. "Mr. Blackwater, your romantic idealism is touching but irrelevant. The American people want purity, order, strength. They're perfectly willing to look the other way when we eliminate the weak links in their society." Maggie and the other surviving girls were loaded into a third wagon, their destination unknown but undoubtedly grim. As they rolled through the Montana darkness, Sarah Mitchell grabbed Maggie's hand with desperate intensity. "They're going to kill us," Sarah whispered. "All of us. We know too much about their operation." Elizabeth Hartwell, barely conscious from months of abuse, managed to lift her head. Not all of us," she gasped. "My uncle, Senator Cromwell, he thinks I died months ago. If I could reach him—" The revelation struck like lightning. Elizabeth was related to Senator Augustus Cromwell, one of the architects of Project Purity. But she'd been sent to the facility under an assumed name, presumably to hide the scandal of having an imperfect family member. "He doesn't know you're alive?" Maggie asked urgently. "Family secret," Elizabeth breathed. "Too shameful to acknowledge publicly. But if he knew what they're really doing here—" It was a desperate gambit, but their only chance. As the wagon approached a river crossing where the guards would need to slow down, Maggie made her decision. Using techniques Jerry had taught her during their secret meetings, she worked at the rope binding her wrists until her hands came free. The escape attempt was chaos incarnate. Maggie threw herself from the moving wagon, rolling into the underbrush as gunshots rang out behind her. Sarah and Mary Catherine followed, but Elizabeth was too weak to jump. The last Maggie saw of her was pale hands pressed against the wagon's rear window as it disappeared into the night. Alone in the Montana wilderness with winter approaching, bleeding from a dozen cuts and wearing nothing but the tattered remains of her nightgown, Maggie began the longest journey of her life. She had to reach the Whitmore Ranch, find whatever her father had hidden in the rose garden, and somehow expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. But first she had to survive. 3 days of stumbling through the Montana wilderness had reduced Maggie to a specter of her former self. Her nightgown hung in tatters. Her bare feet were raw and bleeding, and hunger gnawed at her belly like a living thing. But desperation had given her a strength she'd never known she possessed. Following creek beds and game trails, navigating by the stars her father had taught her to read as a child, she finally glimpsed the familiar outline of the Whitmore Ranch house against the December dawn. The estate was eerily quiet as she approached through the back pastures. No smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimneys, no horses moved in the corrals, and an air of abandonment hung over the entire property like a funeral shroud. Tom Bradley, the foreman, found her collapsed by the kitchen door and carried her inside with tears streaming down his weathered face. "Miss Maggie, sweet Jesus, we thought you were dead," he whispered as he wrapped her in blankets and forced warm broth between her cracked lips. "The marshals came through here 3 days ago, said there'd been an accident at the facility, told us you and your father both died in a fire." "Where is everyone?" Maggie's voice was barely a croak. "Scattered to the winds. Federal agents seized the ranch, said it was forfeit due to the judge's crimes. Most of the hands lit out for greener pastures when the paychecks stopped coming." Tom's eyes were hollow with grief. "I stayed because I promised your mother I'd look after you, but I figured that promise died with you." Through her exhaustion and pain, Maggie remembered her father's desperate words. "Tom, I need to get to the rose garden, the 13th bush. Papa said Mama left something there." Tom helped her to the garden behind the main house where Eleanor Whitmore's beloved roses stood withered by early frost. The 13th bush was indeed different from the others, smaller, planted slightly apart, and when Tom began digging around its base with a spade, his blade struck something hard. The metal box they unearthed contained treasures beyond gold. Eleanor Whitmore's private journals, legal documents, and most importantly, a detailed confession written in her elegant script. As Maggie read by lamplight in the empty ranch house, the final pieces of the conspiracy fell into place. Eleanor had discovered the truth about Project Purity months before her death. Her own physician, Dr. Benjamin Blackwater, Jerry's father, had confided in her about suspicious deaths among his wealthier patients. Together, they had begun investigating the network of wellness facilities, documenting names, locations, and the federal funding that supported them. December 15, 1878, Eleanor had written, "Benjamin brought me disturbing news today. Senator Cromwell's Committee for National Improvement is not what it appears. Under the guise of public health, they are systematically eliminating those they deem genetically inferior. The overweight, the disabled, the mentally ill, and anyone else who fails to meet their standard of American perfection. They use family shame and medical authority to hide their murders." The journal entries revealed a love story as well as a conspiracy. Dr. Blackwater had risked everything to help Eleanor gather evidence, and she had fallen in love with his courage and integrity, but their investigation had been discovered, leading to Eleanor's murder and Dr. Blackwater's disgrace. February 3, 1879, Eleanor's final entry read, "They know we are close to exposing them. Benjamin believes they will move against us soon. If something happens to me, I pray Ezekiel will understand that my death was not natural. I have hidden copies of all our evidence in the 13th rose bush, the one Benjamin planted for me when we first began working together. Tell my daughter that love is worth any sacrifice and that the truth will always find a way to bloom, even in the darkest soil." The evidence Eleanor and Dr. Blackwater had gathered was damning. Financial records, correspondence, medical reports, and a complete list of facilities across the nation. But the most shocking revelation came in a letter from Senator Cromwell himself, outlining the ultimate goal of Project Purity, the complete elimination of undesirable bloodlines from American society within 20 years. Tom Bradley found Maggie weeping over the documents as the sun rose. "What are you going to do with all this?" he asked gently. "I'm going to finish what my mother started," Maggie said with newfound determination. "But first, I need to find Jerry." Using the ranch's remaining resources, Tom helped Maggie launch a desperate rescue mission. The federal detention facility in Helena was a fortress, but Tom knew men who owed the Whitmore family favors, former ranch hands who had gone to work for the territorial government, suppliers who had prospered through Judge Whitmore's business, and most importantly, a telegraph operator named Samuel Cox who had been in love with Eleanor Whitmore since childhood. "Your mother saved my brother's life once," Cox told Maggie when she appeared in his office disguised as a ranch boy. "Paid for his surgery when he got kicked by a horse. I've been waiting 20 years to repay that debt." Through Cox's telegraph network, word of the evidence spread like wildfire to reform-minded politicians, crusading journalists, and federal investigators who weren't part of Cromwell's conspiracy. But the response wasn't what Maggie had hoped for. Instead of outrage and demands for justice, she received a chilling message from Washington. "Surrender yourself and the documents within 48 hours, or Jeremiah Blackwater will be executed for murder of a federal agent." The choice was impossible. Expose the conspiracy and watch the man she loved die, or sacrifice hundreds of potential victims to save one life. But as Maggie agonized over the decision, an unexpected ally appeared at the ranch house door. Elizabeth Hartwell stood on the porch like a ghost returned from the grave, supported by a distinguished older man in a senatorial coat. She had somehow survived her recapture and convinced her uncle, Senator Cromwell himself, to come to Montana. "Miss Whitmore," Senator Cromwell said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and guilt, "my niece has told me things that have shaken my faith in everything I believed I was fighting for." The senator's transformation was remarkable. Confronted with the reality of what his National Improvement Committee had become, he had undergone a crisis of conscience that reminded Maggie powerfully of her own father's journey. Elizabeth's near-death experience had finally opened his eyes to the monstrous machine he had helped create. "I thought we were protecting America's future," Cromwell confessed, his hands shaking as he examined Eleanor's evidence, "preventing the weak from dragging down the strong. But what we've become, this isn't improvement, it's genocide." Together, they hatched a plan that was audacious in its simplicity. Senator Cromwell would return to Washington and call for immediate congressional hearings, using his position to grant immunity to witnesses and protection for evidence. Meanwhile, Maggie and Elizabeth would travel to Helena to coordinate Jerry's release and the liberation of other prisoners. But as they prepared to leave the ranch, a telegram arrived that changed everything. "Jeremiah Blackwater escaped federal custody, stop, presumed dead after fall from train bridge, stop body, not recovered, stop." Maggie's world collapsed. After everything they had endured, all the love they had discovered in the darkest places, Jerry was gone. The evidence that could bring down the conspiracy felt meaningless in the face of such devastating loss. It was Elizabeth who reminded her what was at stake. "He didn't die so you could give up," she said firmly. "He died so others wouldn't have to. Honor that sacrifice." As they prepared to travel to Washington with Senator Cromwell, Maggie took one last walk through her mother's rose garden. The 13th bush, despite the winter frost, had somehow produced a single red bloom, an impossible flower blooming in the darkness just as her mother had promised. Standing there in the Montana snow, holding the evidence that would topple a government conspiracy and clutching the memory of a love that had transformed her from victim to survivor to warrior, Maggie Whitmore finally understood the truth her parents had died to protect, that love and justice were the same force, and that sometimes the greatest act of love was refusing to let evil triumph. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since her ordeal began, Maggie felt ready to fight. The train to Washington carried more than passengers that frigid January morning in 1886. It carried the seeds of revolution. Maggie sat in the first-class compartment Senator Cromwell had arranged, her mother's evidence secured in a leather satchel on her lap, watching the American landscape roll past the windows. She had gained back some of the weight she'd lost during her ordeal, but more importantly, she carried herself with a new confidence that turned heads wherever she went. Elizabeth sat beside her, no longer the broken girl from the facility, but a woman transformed by purpose. "Are you ready for this?" she asked as the Capitol dome came into view through the morning mist. "I've been ready my whole life," Maggie replied, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "I just didn't know it until now." The congressional hearing room was packed to capacity when they arrived. Newspaper reporters filled the gallery, their pencils poised to capture every word of what promised to be the most explosive testimony in decades. Senator Cromwell had kept his word, using his considerable influence to ensure the hearings would be public and that key witnesses would be protected by congressional immunity. But as Maggie took the witness stand, her heart nearly stopped. Sitting in the third row, very much alive despite the reports of his death, was Jeremiah Blackwater. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and she saw in his gaze the same love that had sustained her through the darkest nights of her captivity. Later, during a recess, Jerry explained his miraculous survival. The train crash was real, but I managed to grab onto some brush as I fell, spent 2 weeks in a mining camp recovering, then made my way east when I heard about the hearings. He touched her face with infinite tenderness. I told you I'd find you again. The reunion was everything Maggie had dreamed of, but there was no time for extended celebration. The conspiracy they were fighting had tentacles reaching into the highest levels of government, and their enemies were already moving to discredit their testimony. Marshal Vincent Crawford appeared as a witness for the defense, painting Dr. Hartwell as a legitimate physician and the Whitmore family as mentally unstable. Judge Whitmore was suffering from advanced stages of dementia, he testified with practiced authority. His daughter exhibits similar signs of mental deterioration, including elaborate fantasies about government conspiracies. It was a clever strategy, and Maggie watched with growing alarm as some of the congressmen began to nod in agreement. The same prejudices that had sent her to the facility in the first place, the assumption that someone like her couldn't possibly be credible, were being weaponized against her testimony. But Eleanor Whitmore's evidence spoke louder than any witness. Document after document proved the existence of Project Purity, complete with financial records, correspondence, and medical reports spanning 5 years. The photographs Jerry had taken at the facility corroborated every detail of Maggie's account. The breakthrough came when Elizabeth took the stand. As Senator Cromwell's niece, her testimony carried weight that Maggie's could not. With quiet dignity, she described the horrors she had witnessed, the friends who had died under Dr. Hartwell's treatment, and the systematic nature of the abuse. They told us we were being improved, Elizabeth said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber. But improvement doesn't require torture. Healing doesn't happen through starvation and terror. What they did to us wasn't medicine, it was murder dressed up in medical terminology. The defense tried to shake her testimony, suggesting she had been brainwashed by radical elements seeking to embarrass her uncle. But Elizabeth's response silenced the room. Gentlemen, I watched girls die. I held their hands as they drew their last breaths. No political agenda could make me fabricate that pain. As the days of testimony continued, a broader picture emerged. Project Purity was just one tentacle of a vast network of abuse spanning the entire nation. Wealthy families had been sending their imperfect children to facilities from California to New York, believing they were helping them while actually funding their elimination. The most damning testimony came from Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician who had worked briefly at one of the facilities before his conscience forced him to flee. The mortality rate was over 40%, he testified. But the deaths were always recorded as accidents or complications from pre-existing conditions. Families were told their children had died peacefully, never knowing they had been systematically murdered. Public opinion shifted like an avalanche as the hearings continued. Newspaper headlines screamed about government-sponsored genocide, and angry crowds gathered outside the Capitol demanding justice. But Maggie knew that exposure was only the first step. Real change would require dismantling an entire system of institutionalized cruelty. The personal cost of their victory became clear when Senator Cromwell took the stand to testify against his own committee. With tears streaming down his face, he read from documents he had signed, appropriations he had approved, reports he had ignored. I told myself we were protecting America's future, he said, but we were destroying America's soul. His testimony destroyed his political career but saved hundreds of lives. Within weeks, federal marshals were raiding facilities across the country, arresting doctors and administrators, and liberating survivors who had been written off as dead by their families. But the conspiracy's death throes were violent. On the final day of testimony, as Maggie was leaving the Capitol building, a carriage careened toward her with obvious murderous intent. Jerry threw himself between her and the oncoming horses, taking a glancing blow that sent him sprawling across the cobblestones. The driver was Marshal Crawford, making one last desperate attempt to silence the woman who had brought down his operation, but the crowd of supporters who had gathered to protect Maggie overwhelmed him before he could complete his mission. Crawford was arrested on the Capitol steps, his career and conspiracy both ending in ignominious defeat. As Jerry recovered from his injuries in a Washington hospital, Maggie sat by his bedside and made plans for their future. The congressional hearings had made them national celebrities, but more importantly, they had sparked a movement for reform that was spreading across the country. "What do you want to do now?" Jerry asked, his hand intertwined with hers. "I want to go home," Maggie said simply. "I want to rebuild the ranch as a place of healing instead of a place of pain. I want to help other survivors find their way back to themselves." The Whitmore Ranch, which had been seized by the federal government, was returned to Maggie as part of the settlement. But she envisioned something greater than simply restoring it to its former glory. Using the compensation money awarded to survivors, she planned to create a refuge where people who had been broken by society's cruelty could learn to see themselves as whole again. Jerry would be her partner in every sense, in love, in marriage, and in the work of healing a wounded world. They were married in the spring of 1886, not in a grand cathedral, but in Eleanor Whitmore's rose garden, surrounded by survivors of the facilities and the congressional allies who had fought beside them. The ceremony was simple but profound. Maggie wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her perfectly without apology or shame. Jerry's vows spoke of seeing her not as she had been broken, but as she had chosen to rebuild herself. "I don't promise to complete you," he said, "because you are already whole. I promise to stand beside you as we build something beautiful together." As they exchanged rings made from Montana silver, Maggie thought of her parents, whose love story had begun in investigation and ended in sacrifice. Their deaths had not been in vain. From the ashes of tragedy, a new kind of love had bloomed, one that refused to be diminished by society's narrow definitions of worth. The ranch became exactly what Maggie had envisioned, a place where broken people learned to be beautiful again. Under the big Montana sky, survivors of all kinds of abuse found safety, purpose, and most importantly, the radical idea that they deserved love exactly as they were. Years later, as Maggie watched Jerry teaching their adopted children to ride horses in the same pastures where her own childhood had been marked by isolation, she understood the deepest truth her ordeal had taught her, that sometimes the people who love us most do hurt us, but real love always finds a way to heal what it has wounded. The 13th rose bush bloomed every spring without fail, a living reminder that even in the darkest soil, love will always find a way to grow. For those of us who've lived long enough to understand that life's greatest lessons often come wrapped in our deepest pain, Maggie and Jerry's story reminds us of a profound truth. Sometimes the people who love us most do hurt us, but that doesn't make their love any less real. As parents, we've all made decisions we thought were protecting our children, only to realize later we might have wounded the very souls we were trying to save. Judge Whitmore's desperate attempts to strengthen his daughter nearly destroyed her. Yet his love was genuine, just misguided by fear and society's cruel expectations. How many of us have carried guilt about harsh words spoken in worry, strict rules imposed out of love, or dreams we pushed on our children that weren't really theirs? Maggie's journey from victim to survivor to healer shows us that forgiveness, both giving and receiving it, can transform the deepest wounds into sources of strength. Her love story with Jerry proves that real love sees past society's shallow judgments to the beautiful soul within. In our golden years, we have the wisdom to recognize that love isn't perfect, but it can be redemptive. What family wound in your own life needed forgiveness to heal? Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone and trusting them to be strong enough to face the truth? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your wisdom might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.